So I have someone that long-time Grail Country followers will definitely know very well. This is Michael, who was at Grail Country from the beginning, and at whose insistence I decided to launch the Grail Country project after much prodding. I'm glad I did. I'm glad he was persistent about bugging me to do it. We are actually inaugurating a brand new series. We're going to do a series on Owen Barfield's book, Romanticism Comes of Age. And I think for this discussion, there's an essay that you wanted to start with, which is not, we're not necessarily going in order
Yeah.
of how the essays appear in the book. And the essay that you wanted to start with was Reason, Speech, and Imagination,
Hmm.
which I have read exactly one time on my lunch break today because I just like, and I have the copy I'm working from is a PDF of the 1944 version, so it's actually different from. So while I'm waiting for, like, for whatever reason, it's like a slow boat from Amazon for this particular book.
Yeah.
While I'm waiting to get a copy that matches the edition that Michael's using, which is we're using the which it is, like, it's the one from the 80s.
This
Yeah, that's the
one,
one. Okay, yeah, okay.
and actually, I think it's actually even older than that because it's like
Okay.
66.
66. Okay, so 1966.
Wesleyan University.
Mm,
This
okay.
must have been when he was over here doing all this time talking at U.S. colleges or
Right.
something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. So, and it's a new edition with some extra added essays. Because the book was a collection of essays to begin with, which he just kind of slapped an introduction onto. Yeah, the version I have is only 162 pages long. So it's like as soon as I saw the page count, I knew there was like, hey, the version I got is different. In any case, that's the book we're going to talk about, and we're going to kind of go essay by essay. And we're starting with this one, which I think was a good choice. I think it's a really critical concept. And since this was your idea and you suggested the essay, I'll let you open with your thoughts and or any questions that you have.
Yeah.
First question I have to
Yeah.
ask is, did you see the conversation I had with Ted this morning by chance?
No.
Okay.
I don't even think I know. I mean, I'm so out of like the
Almost the whole
full. Yeah.
conversation ended up being
Yeah.
about poetry.
Oh, interesting.
And then
Ted,
this is the essay that you pick out. And it's like, so I couldn't help but chuckle while I was reading it on my lunch about how resonant it was with the discussion I'd already recorded and posted earlier today.
what's Ted's backstory?
So I met Ted at Chino, and
Uh,
he is probably about your close to your age, you know.
mhm.
So he's not like a young guy, but younger than me. And a young father with kids who converted to Catholicism about a year ago. Him and his wife converted to Catholicism about a year ago, and him and his wife sing in the choir at a traditional Latin Mass church. And he's like, he's got all the enthusiasm of a recent convert, and he's really smart and really just. I couldn't believe how easily, like, I had met him already, but even despite the fact that I had met him already, the fact that we fell into that conversation so easily, as if I was talking to somebody that I'd known forever. Like,
That's
we
awesome.
immediately understood each other's communication style, like, really well, which I think is like a lot. That's which I think the thing I just said actually plays into the essay we're going to talk about, right? Because there's more
Absolutely.
to because there's more to communication than just the words that we use.
Absolutely.
So, which is kind of
And
like, if you were to want to super condense Barfield's main point here, is that it's well, I think what he talks about is word instead of words, right? Word with a capital W versus words.
yeah.
One of the
Well,
distinctions he draws in the essay.
what's interesting is you notice that you did meet them in person first, right?
Yes,
And
we
that
had met
is
in person first.
there is some there is
It wasn't like a cold meeting that no one had ever met before.
there is something about that because like it's like And it's a great analogy between the difference between the prosaic and the poetic form of communication in a certain sense, right? Because like the in person, the bandwidth stream that's coming at you is just like infinitely greater.
Right.
Even in something like this where it's video and I mean I can see you, I can make you out,
There's
but like
not
there's
nearly
just
as much actual information coming in as if we were in person. Yeah.
yeah.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. It's not even
And
3-dimensional,
yeah,
right?
I was on Twitter the other day. I mean, I'm never really on any of the social media things.
No, I'd have
I'm on
never seen you do anything on Twitter except for
I
occasionally. You occasionally show up. I'll like every once in a while I'll tag you on the off chance that you'll see it because I know you're not on Twitter much, and occasionally I'll see you like something that where I tagged you. But
I can't figure out how to use Twitter effectively, and like I hate that like whenever I get on it, I end up looking at something I didn't intend to look at and feel like I wasted like 10 or 15 minutes doing that. And so like I try not, I try to avoid social media completely for that reason. I just because time is so precious. But I was looking at like I have this one account that like is just like I just use it to follow stuff in security because like it's yeah, it's so hard. I mean, in technology to like get good streams of information on what's new, and like I feel like on Twitter there's a good crowd of folks that like talk about cybersecurity and such, and especially cybersecurity in the cloud, which is kind of where I'm focused right now. So it's like I'm always interested in kind of like tidbits about what people are talking about. But
yeah, that's
anyway, like
kind
I
of
just
like generally viewed as Twitter's strength as a news delivery platform.
yeah, and it's really great where you have like these kind of like little communities where people are all kind of posting for each other's benefit because they all kind of like interact with each other around this like kind of niche topic. But anyway, this guy was talking about um this like security problem that like it
Yeah, I
wasn't really
talk
a
I
secret.
talk with like the same like dozen people on Twitter all the time. Basically, it's like Paul, Michael Martin, Jordan Daniel Wood.
Yeah,
You know,
and when there's like
Father
a
Father
larger
Camel,
con
Tom Belts. I mean, it's
yeah
just a
like
really small group.
that when there's a larger context to the conversation, there's even those little, short, retorts carry a lot more information, right? Because
Yeah,
you can extrapolate them back into that context and know, oh yeah, that's I know what Paul's angling for here or whatever the case may be. But anyway, this
yeah.
guy
And
was
if
talking
it's
about
like if it's like the TL, I mean TLC Twitter, like everybody understands the same shorthand, so
yeah,
you can condense things more effectively.
there's a jargon, but this guy was talking about like this. I mean, so he's in security, but he ended up getting involved in like something that was essentially like a help desk support case. So you've worked in tech, so you know what this is
Mhm.
like. You have like these different tiers of things, and like so this problem, like it was like somebody like their copy paste stopped working or something like that, and
Okay.
but it because it coincided with them installing some sort of browser plugin, it kept getting escalated until they thought it was like a security issue. So it like goes up all these ladders. And this is like guy that's like at the top of securing the company. So he's like, he's like super interested to figure out. And like, and they, like basically the long, the short version of it rather is like just that they spend all this time and then somehow he like gets like in person with her or something like that and figures out it was like um the, it was like some button that was being pushed on this mouse, but you just couldn't see that. Like in all this, everybody
Right.
had all those assumptions about how things worked that just
Yeah.
couldn't make it through the bandwidth of like email and text and even people doing Zoom
That's
conversations with
why
each
like
other.
doing any kind of like support by email or phone or anything like that where you can't like see the actual device, it's always hard.
Yeah, when I got my start in technology doing like help desk stuff, and I worked at places where I would like cover like large campuses, and you'd walk and you'd actually go into somebody's office and like something wasn't working, and being able to you'd sit down with somebody and watch them do it, and like I mean, like I can't even imagine how you do this stuff remotely because like a lot of you have all these assumptions about like that somebody understands how computers work the way you do. So when they say word X, it means this.
Yep.
And like at that time, I especially
There's the
like people,
opposite problem too, where the IT staff just assumes that the end user is an idiot and just assumes it's user error.
yeah.
Which when I
Exactly.
like the IT staff at my work knows me well enough now to like not do that to me. But I tell you what, anytime I start a new job and it's like that is like that's like the default assumption of most IT is just like they just kind of go right to user error.
Yeah.
I you know
It's
I know I understand it from their perspective too because it is user error a lot of the
yeah,
time,
yeah,
you know.
yeah,
So I've been on the
yeah.
other side of that, so I know why they think that, but it's yeah.
Anyway, but like I it because I guess the reason I was in when we were talking about having a conversation why I was coming wanting to come back to Barfield is I really get the sense in a certain way that like he's just somebody that's so even by people that have read him a lot, and I include myself in this bucket, he's just very poorly understood for all sorts of reasons because our access to him comes through these
There are
texts.
layers. There
Yeah,
are layers to Barfield, and it's like I think like I always like that Kathleen Rain uh talk that I shared with you that actually Sherry is the one who pointed out to me about a year and a half ago. And then I mentioned it in the conversation on that hideous strength, and Karen asked for it, and she really liked it too. And it's like if you want to just like understand what Barfield's main driving point is, you can actually listen to that 55-minute
yeah,
talk by Kathleen Rain and get it. But that doesn't mean that there's not more depths within Barfield. So it's like people should still read Barfield because there's a lot more treasure there, but you do have to mine for it. It's not
yeah,
right on the surface.
yeah. And I just yeah, I feel like it's so easy to take what he says and run because um he he spends so much time too just trying to talk to kind of a lot of what he's doing is speaking in propositions to try and talk people out of propositional thinking.
But yeah,
But
that's right.
but that argument is so
He's
layered and
using
complex.
propositions in order to point at the limitation of propositional thinking. Yeah.
Exactly. And sometimes I feel like what gets lost is that he is trying to point to something different rather than because I mean he's clearly uh, very, very intelligent to the point that his writing at times can be almost incomprehensible because he will have these sentences that have like 20 asides in the middle of the sentence. Like they're like, and so I'm like, I can't, a lot of times
Well,
I'm like,
because what he's trying to communicate is literally inarticulable and he knows it.
yeah,
So then all the best he can do is like, okay, let me try to figure out what kind of signposting I can give in order to try to get the reader to the place where I'm looking so that they can see it for themselves.
yeah, he,
Um,
yeah, he's difficult to read, but, well, I'm curious, like, what were your first
which is why
impressions?
Steiner doesn't even like it's interesting because you can see he talks about the way Steiner would just like not even bother to make discursive arguments at all and just would make assertions. Now, Barfield has chosen not to do that, clearly. I mean, Barfield does make discursive arguments for what he's trying to show you.
Yeah.
Um, um,
Well,
what,
and like a big percentage of what Barfield seems to be doing is trying to get people to take Steiner seriously.
yes. So I think it's the people, I think that's exactly it. And I think specifically it's the people who won't just cannot live with just an assertion. So basically, what he's pointing at is that your logical reasoning is never going to get you to the place that you want to be.
Yeah. Um, one of the things I found really interesting in this chapter is I feel like he gives a little bit higher resolution to some of the more recent kind of stages in the evolution of consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And specifically, he makes this delineation between what he calls the intellectual soul and the consciousness soul, with the intellectual soul being kind of more from say the Middle Ages,
Yes.
and then the consciousness soul. He it's weird because like sometimes it's hard to read because like in this essay he kind of
I think he has
says,
in mind specifically there. Like, I don't think, like, I don't know if what he's saying about the medieval soul would apply to, like, say, an early medieval, like, Boethius, but it certainly would apply to, like, a late medieval scholastic
yeah,
thinker.
yeah, and he talks about how like for the medievals they kind of worship had this sort of worship of logic,
Yes.
um, and that they saw that this sort of connection between the word and reality, and also he says that the big thing for the intellectual soul is they identified themselves with their own thoughts,
Yeah.
like what in a certain sense, like, and this is why we have such a hard time now understanding why people were like being burned at the
It's
stake
like
for what they
they believe,
said.
essentially, to put it, they believe in the possibility of a logical contact with the real. And what Barfield is pointing toward is something more like a poetic contact with the real,
Yeah. um
which
I
is
mean
kind of, go ahead.
I'm just curious in your conception, like because it's hard to know how to read some of the stuff. I mean, like for me it's still very fuzzy, like probably like I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago I would have given a much more black and white reading of Barfield that just kind of made sense to me. That was very, it held together in terms of a mental model for me. But it's like the more I read Barfield, the more that's fallen apart for me. And
Yeah.
but I'm because like one of the things is like in a certain sense you could say like all this sort of falling away from original consciousness is a bad thing, right? Because
He
it's a
definitely does not see it as a bad thing.
right. But it has these negative consequences that
Yeah.
um that kind of that force us into, in a certain sense what it does is it forces each successive generation to not be able to just copy paste what came before.
Right.
Like they have a sort of new challenge put before them, and a sort of new question being asked of them in terms of the grand narrative.
Yeah.
And um and so but I guess but basically what he, in a certain sense what he says is that like he uses this, I've never heard of this book he refers to. It's like some book about oh great, I lost my place. um some book called More Trivia. Never heard of this book, but he basically, it's a fairly long quote that he makes
Right.
where he basically talks about how the moderns experience of their thoughts in a certain sense are not, they don't experience them as their own thoughts.
Right.
So this guy's looking at the heavens and he's having all these sort of thoughts go through his mind. And then his response to it is he says, but these thoughts are not my thoughts. They eddy through my mind like scraps of old paper or withered leaves in the wind. What I really feel is the survival of a much more primitive mood, a view of the world which dates indeed from before the invention of language. And then he says basically says that it can't be put into words. He says, but sometimes far at night, I have heard a dog howling at the moon.
Yeah.
Um, but and then he goes on to say about just how like this is really the thing that defines our era, is the sense in which we have all these thoughts that uh, we're kind of looking at and sorting between, and even in some extent I think and this sort of uh explosion of long form content on YouTube, it's I think a sort of recognition, because in a certain sense like it doesn't, you get the sense that we're so overwhelmed with the amount of propositional content just that is put before us all the time. And so we, in a certain sense, there's almost like very little thinking that we do ourselves. We're always kind of selecting from pre-formulated all this sort of magnificent menu of options that's put before us that we select and we say, okay, that's good, that's a little bit better. And sort of what's been going on in this little corner of the internet, but just, I think in the podcast format across the board, is this sort of this recognition that like the sort of soundbite stuff we've gotten before isn't a rich enough like set of Lego blocks to work with. And so we're like, part of what we're doing when we watch, all these people, have conversations, is we're getting better, more higher resolution Lego blocks because for some reason it's
especially in cases where people talk to each other frequently.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's I don't know if I don't know if I can actually like give you more than that.
I know exactly what you're saying. I mean, well, it's kind of like, we were talking last night about how the origin story of Grail Country, and some of that kind of, we were just sort of like philosophizing about like what's going on with this, the meaning crisis, all this stuff. And one of the things that popped to my mind was this whole thing where when people are talking about their own stories, there's something there that's really, I don't know, it's that's in my experience, that's where I find all the real gold, and like is where there's some sort of contact between these quote unquote, propositional ideas in some real experience.
Well,
right?
Tell me what you think of this. In the conversation I had with Ted this morning, I was actually linking the kind of poetic approach to a deeper something that's deeper than, because poetry is deeper than ordinary language, right? So there's a way in which, like, let's call it the poetic mood, is connected to the concept of witness, because that's what a good poet does.
Yeah.
Is they bear witness to this little slice of reality that they're deciding to treat in the poem.
Yeah.
And they're trying to present it as fully real as close as they can approximate, so that yeah. So yeah, I don't know. I don't really know a better
No,
way.
that makes sense. I've kind of conceptualized before of a poem is, it's kind of a photograph of consciousness, or an attempt to be like a photograph of that kind of glimpse, that
like,
moment,
yeah, of like, and
of
just like this, like a moment, right? I think it's it's an attempt at like actually capturing the presence.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
That's a great point. Like it's a sense of it's an extended like meditation on the moreness of that one moment.
Correct. And trying to witness to everything that it discloses. And the content of everything that it discloses is more than words can convey, which is why poetry is not concerned with just like, the meaning of the words, but like their arrangement and their sound and the music and all these other elements that try to make language go beyond what language can normally communicate.
Yeah.
But even then, it's all like, even poetry and song are still only a gesture toward deeper poetry and deeper song.
Right. Yeah, because it's funny because and this is again a thing where Barfield can be hard to read, especially if you read any bit of this out of context, it falls flat, because like for part of it you think he's making this argument about that, well, all these ideas can't be put into words, and you're like, well, it seems like he's like drinking too deeply at the well of postmodernism, and then he says, but when I'm saying that, I mean specifically as the modern logician conceptualizes of what words are and what they mean.
Right.
But there is this other mode
Yep.
of interaction that it does feel like, I don't know, it we poetry as an art form is I don't know, like it feels like it's at its lowest point in terms of like the sort of acclaim and recognition and attention that it receives.
Yeah, there's an interesting friend of Michael Martin's that I kind of that's one of the people that I like to listen to on Twitter. Who's a writer. His name is Jonathan Geltner. And I can remember in his conversation with Michael Martin, they were talking about this on Michael Martin's podcast, the Regeneration podcast. And I think I don't know. Let's see what you think of his idea. What he suggested is that the reason that poetry is not popular anymore is because we need people to start attempting long form poetry again.
Hmm.
And
Interesting.
that's what people really would respond to.
You know what's
Which seems
funny is,
counterintuitive. It's like
yeah,
if you can't even get people to read like a collection of short verse, what makes you think that they would read a long
I
form
know.
poem?
You know what's funny is like I've never been able to get into long form verse, like for whatever reason. Like I it's like I know it's a sort of deficiency in um my own makeup, because
I think the move of poetry away from long form verse is a good thing in the
yeah.
development of poetry. I don't agree with him. I mean,
Okay.
I kind of like. I mean, I want to see poetry popular again, but I actually think that like long form poetry attempts too much. It stretches poetry beyond what I think it can do.
Mm-hmm.
Although, I mean, I don't know. Like maybe I might be very very wrong at that point because I also made the argument this morning in the conversation with Ted that one could see the entire, not just sections of the Bible, but the entire Bible of poetry, and the fact that the law is chanted in the synagogue is your hint
Yeah.
toward that
Yeah.
reality. And um so yeah, I mean, I'd entertain the idea. I don't know.
Yeah.
See me being very much the kind of modern person
Yeah. Yeah.
that
I know. Right.
I don't I have no ownership of the thought. I'm willing to sit here and entertain any number of them.
Yeah. It is like, yeah, how do we reboot poetry, because it is I don't know, like in
But
terms of like making a point or feeling or putting forth a sense of your own worthiness to speak on a subject, like poetical language is, I don't know, it just doesn't have a lot of room in our culture.
well,
um
there was a time where it lived on in some of like I mean, some of the really great American songwriters are legitimately can be considered poets, you
yeah.
know. Um, Bob Dylan, John Prine, those are two that I would argue for right off the top of my head. But like there aren't any more Bob Dylan's or John Prines either. So
Yeah.
like not even well, I don't know. Maybe I don't listen to enough. I'm sure someone can find something that's going on in contemporary music that maybe that's not necessarily popular, but I'm sure that there's some great songwriting that
Yeah, I'm
can be
sure there
considered
is
poetry
too.
going on somewhere. It's just that I don't know about it because I'm an old guy and I listen to old stuff mostly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it kind of like lived on in song for a bit longer, but now it's like most of the music that we listen to is like so um just shallow.
You know, it's interesting. So he talks about in this poem, I'm sorry, this poem, this essay, he talks about Shakespeare, he doesn't even say Shakespeare's name, but he just says England's greatest writer and assumes you
Mm.
know who he's talking about.
Yeah.
And he says he's making the point that, first of all, that England is somehow specially associated with the consciousness soul.
Yes.
And because of the fact that they're an island nation, and he's making the point that it's the English speaking peoples that kind of drive this scientific spirit. And but he says something about how Shakespeare creates this matchless gallery of individual characters, each standing on his own feet and valuable for his own sake. He says every conceivable type of man, as someone has pointed out, except the mystic.
Except the mystic, yeah, yeah.
And then, which is interesting because it kind of there is something about Shakespeare. It is poetry, but it doesn't feel. It feels so much different in terms of from the poetry that precedes it, in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
There is something. There's there I don't know. It seems like there's a sharp move towards the prosaic in it somehow. I don't know if maybe that's just my inability to articulate what I'm saying, but because I like the problem I have with, say, like trying to read like Virgil or Dante or things like that. It's not quite there in reading Shakespeare. It's a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I'm curious what you thought about him linking this specific like mode of consciousness and kind of this sort of weight of responsibility
So
in the
yeah,
current age to
I
English
think
speaking peoples.
yeah, I think there is like so let's not for like the consciousness soul, let's not get the consciousness soul confused with the intellectual soul, which will be the medieval type, right? So the
Yeah.
consciousness soul is the modern soul, but the consciousness soul is also the one he sees a capable. So the consciousness soul, despite its downsides, which he points out, the consciousness soul is also the one that has the capability of making this poetic turn that
Yeah.
he's talking about, right? It's all the intellectual soul couldn't do it.
Right. It's like we've come, the point he kind of is making is that we've come to the end of something, and it's like suddenly in the England like is represented this as the island nation, we're suddenly kind of really all alone.
And he ends like, and then he ends by talking about, well, the popularity of Jerusalem maybe points toward a hope for
Yeah.
England. And I think he underestimated, but well, I mean, he's like, I think Barfield is like an example of how I think that England, not necessarily, well, I think maybe England in particular, it's something about the British Isles is also associated with this move toward the poetic turn and this move
Yeah.
toward the imagination. Like this is like it's British thinkers that have developed this, and British thinkers and British poets that have developed this more than anyone else. It's Blake, it's
Yeah.
Coleridge, it's Barfield himself. It's contemporary. A contemporary example would be Malcolm Guite. Like there's
Right.
something where this like and it's specifically it seems to come out of the British Christian culture. So and it doesn't really happen until it doesn't really start to happen until the 19th century. So not I mean so it's like later than Shakespeare. So but you do kind of see this like kind of beginning with like the English romantics. You see this like this awakening of this like within British Christian culture for this appreciation for the imagination as more than the imagination was conceived of as capable of being before,
Right.
right? Especially within Christian circles. And
Yeah.
that's kind of like, and that's one of the, I mean, and the imagination is absolutely critical to the turn he's talking about.
Yeah. He quotes Kate.
This is like I always tell people, it's like people, I mean, because obviously I talk about, like, I talk with a lot of Orthodox people, and I talk about a lot of Orthodox thinkers. I had Jordan Daniel Wood on to talk about his book about Maximus the Confessor, lots of Orthodox references. And it's like, well, this thing right here that we're talking about, this is what keeps me Anglican and proud to be Anglican, because
Right.
this really is a unique genius of the British Christian tradition.
I absolutely agree. There's some sort of marriage between different perspectives that's being put in here. So I wonder if it would be helpful to put a finer point on imagination, because that you're right,
I
that
think it's
is kind
something
of
that comes out of this union of the Anglo-Saxon and the Celtic strain,
right.
right? So there's like so maybe the Anglo-Saxon strain is maybe more dominant in the earlier consciousness soul, where, like, where the scientific mindset and the is being developed, and you have the peak of withdrawal of participation. So maybe that's something about, maybe there's something that makes the Anglo-Saxon soul prone to that, but
Right.
Britain still has the underlying Celtic influence. And I think there's something about happens with English Romanticism that awakens that Celtic part of the consciousness, and it causes this kind of mixture of elements to develop this, like, great intellectual movement that begins to celebrate the imagination, as well as the creation of amazing, like, some of my favorite poetry personally.
Yeah. I wonder if it'd be helpful for me to read some of this and get you to respond to it, because I
Okay,
think
go for it.
just to try and get it, because I feel like this point is confusing for me, and I wonder if it's confusing for others. But he talks about Coleridge's conception of the imagination, um, where he actually he called this a glimmering of the special relation of this concrete or inspired thinking to the consciousness soul. And when he says concrete here, he says it like in a footnote that what he's saying is a sort of thinking that's neither subjective nor objective. And he says there is a concrete thinking which experience alone can prove, which is independent of the senses. And there's an abstract logistic thinking which is entirely dependent on them, which is what he talks about earlier, where reason is kind of dependent on the senses, which is dependent on reason. But this thing's completely independent of those. But between these two, there's an intermediate stage at which consciousness takes the form of pictures or images. In the history of mankind, that intermediate stage contains the mystery of the myth. It still contains today the mystery of poetry, and with that, the whole mystery of meaning. It is imagination. Imagination is the marriage of spirit and sense. Therefore, the consciousness soul, which is the ego cut right off from sense by its abstract thoughts, will have in its passage back to its home in the spirit to pass this intermediate stage of imaginative consciousness. That is, the peculiar relation of the consciousness soul to the concrete or to the word. The consciousness soul is cut off from knowledge. Does it wish to know again? That it must become the imaginative soul. So he's sort of making this point, like we're kind of like we've reached this sort of zenith of travel away from. It's almost like
Well,
you could see like these sort of layers where like this abstract thinking was built on these sort of, like, if you look at these word meanings to these sort of central ideas of about space and the world that we've kind of built out to create these sort of Lego blocks of castles in the sky. But now, like, we've even gotten away from those to the point where we don't experience those, any connection with those as our own. We look at them and we like have like, we're like, okay, that guy's thought system looks better than that guy's, but like there's not a sense of like it belonging to ourself any longer. And like, I guess what he's saying is that complete disconnection now allows us to resume or make some sort of choice around what we do next. Um, and at the end of what's interesting with Barfield too, there's always this sense of in reading him that it's not necessarily the case that I think that he believes anyway that our current civilization is going to survive. Like
No,
we could, like our
there's
current,
no
like,
guarantee of that.
like we could, this whole thing could go, down in the tubes, and we could, um
History
you
tells
know
us this, right? There's
yeah,
no guarantee that our civilization survives.
yeah, it's
Yeah, for sure. That's just true. To me, like the key words there are concrete and image.
mhm.
And again, I can't help but think of, like, that resonated with me when I read it, because again, it called back to the conversation. I had no idea that I was going to read this and talk about this. Call back to what I was saying in the conversation I had this morning with Ted, because I was talking about like how I learned to write poetry. Right. I had a poet.
Yeah,
I decided to take a well, I told the story this morning, so people have already heard it. So I'll try to give you like a super condensed version. I took a poetry class because I thought it would be easy.
mhm.
And then I found out that the instructor's expectations to get a good grade in the class were to actually write good poetry. He absolutely destroyed the first poem that I wrote for the class. And I thought about dropping the class, but I stuck with it. And what he conveyed to me that allowed me to kind of like get it and start writing better poetry is that poetry is rooted in the image.
Yeah,
And it's rooted in the image because like the image is what gives it a concreteness, right? Because the language that I was using in that early poem that he ripped to shreds was rhetorical
yeah,
language,
yeah,
right? It was rhetorical language, and it's like, yeah, like the words sounded good, right? It's like I'm decent with rhetoric, and I've written a lot of speeches, and so I wasn't bad with words, right? So I put together a series of words like that had the shape of a poem. It was arranged in stanzas, and I used nice sounding words, and but it was it lacked concreteness,
yeah,
right? It lacked concreteness because essentially I was trying to convey an argument in a
yeah,
poem. Well, you can't, I mean, that's not, you're fighting against what poetry is if you're trying to deliver an argument through a poem.
yeah,
And so once I had that, like, that's all it took for me to start like writing much better poetry. And so like this is like connected to what he's talking about, because like, and the image is like, I also, it's interesting too, because I actually talked about how when a good poet is writing a poem, they necessarily have to cross the subject object divide, otherwise they cannot be a proper witness to the whatever it is they're writing the poem about.
yeah,
They have to let the strong subject object divide has to disappear in the process of writing the poem, or they're not a proper, which is again, I like, it's about, I want to tie it to, I think I'm right to tie it to this concept of witnessing,
yeah. Well,
because
it's also a sort of, it's a reference to this sort of unity that is consciousness itself, right? Which is like, because we don't, I mean, we do experience our, scattered thoughts in a certain sense, but there's a unity of consciousness that allows us to even have an identity as a self, right? And I think you're getting back to that kind of photograph of consciousness thing. I took a few.
yeah, this is why even though he's talking about the concrete and the imagetic, which is definitely closely related to the senses, what's different about them from just like the sense data itself is that it can present you an image of the wholeness, that whereas the actual sense data itself only tells you about the parts.
Yeah.
Does that make any sense?
Oh yeah, yeah. It's like bringing
Okay.
it. It's a bringing it together. And I remember one of my college. I took a few courses in college as well in creative writing, and I was very shocked about like how impactful they were. But I remember one teacher said something that on poetry that always stuck with me. He said poetry needs to be elusive, and elusive. And so elusive, like with an I, is like the idea there is it has to create an image. There has to
Yeah.
be a painting of some kind, right? There
Mm-hmm.
has to be it has to call like you were saying, it has to call to the concrete details of our sensory world, or else it's and something is lacking.
And not just vision,
Yeah, yeah,
sound,
all the
taste,
senses.
smell. But
And then
they're not the thing is though, they're not the actual senses themselves, right? So that's why Barfield says that thing, because it actually sounds a little bit strange when you start thinking about how he's talking about the concrete and the and the imagetic, like those things actually are there's a connection to the senses, but they're not the actual sense data themselves.
right, it's the senses as meaningfully experienced by consciousness.
Bingo.
Yeah. So, which again pulls it back into that unity. And then the idea of the elusive is a sense that you, as a poet, you're always a part of some conversation, right? You're always having to make reference to what's come before in the conversation. Like a good poetry is never like trying to be so unique and different that he doesn't realize that, hey, there's a context and a conversation to this story I'm in that I
Right.
must call back to, right?
Right. Yeah, and
So
there's a lot of great poems that were written as callbacks to earlier poems.
yeah, and so he says you're like good poetry is always going to have these sort of, it doesn't have to be so super obvious, but it has to have these layers of callbacks to alluding to those other that other part of the conversation. And then elusive, I think, points to the fact that again, poetic language always has within it continual markers and identifiers and reminders that the poet is attempting to communicate something more than can be said, right? It's like,
Yeah.
because and it's especially needed in our time, right? Because we do tend to want to read things literally, like we want to get it down, this means this one thing, versus a truly elusive poem you have to kind of read and play with and roll in your mind to kind of, you're kind of, there's a sort of a frame jarring that's going on to lead you.
Have you ever seen Dead Poet Society?
um I probably have. That's with
Okay. There's a scene where like there's a scene like fairly early on in the film where Robin Williams' character, the teacher, is like he's going through the actual like textbook, and it's like this ridiculous quantitative analysis
yeah.
of poetry, and he just has and he makes fun of it, and then he like has the students all toss it out, like. And I think like that is, I mean, that really is a reflection of how like a lot of people in modernity have wanted to approach poetry
Yeah,
as a
absolutely.
puzzle to be solved.
Well, yeah, I mean, I because of one of my college professors, I still occasionally get the subscription of this, the
Mm-hmm.
New Yorker. And he said it was kind of like, the publication all
You
poets
crazy progressive,
to.
you.
Yeah. No, I mean, I used to really like even the political writing in here because of the fact that because there was such a commitment to having some sort of like, I don't even know what to call it, but a sort of artistic viewpoint that you like, it felt like there was a richness to it and less propaganda, even when it was clear that they were like, the person writing was slanted one way.
Mm-hmm.
In recent years, I feel like that even that's gone from it. But the poetry as well, like I don't know, like I can't, I don't, a lot of these poems I just don't, I don't get them anymore. Like I try and I'm like, it feels like it's it feels like there's some sort of there's some sort of like what am I trying to say? It just feels too analytical. It feels
Yeah.
like it's
Well,
a
also like
it's show off. It's like a show off of like how
yeah.
smart someone
Well,
is like what
confessional poetry is bad too, and the reason confessional poetry is bad is because well, you're just regurgitating the subjective only,
you know.
and you're not doing what a poet is supposed to do, which is to serve as a witness, which is to really to try to transcend the subject object divide.
Mhm.
So it's like you're not allowing for you're not allowing for that interpenetration to happen
Right.
when your poetry is just merely confessional and you're just pouring out like whatever on the page.
Well, it definitely seems like if you have any status nowadays in any way, shape, or form, there's a certain sense that it's too costly to be honest, to be blatantly honest. Like there's just there's too many sacred cows that cannot be touched, that you could even unintentionally trod upon, that people are or even in their innermost thoughts sort of self-censoring
Oh yeah, that's not good for
to
any kind
to
of
to
art.
protect themselves from those sort of fall from graces that might occur if like they don't show not just like care for, but deference to the
So
sort of.
I've been listening to Martin Shaw's newest book, Bard Skull, an audiobook, and I've pre-ordered the hard copy. I First of all, listening to Martin Shaw on audiobook is an absolute treat. So highly recommend.
I need to get that. I know we talked.
And this is why I'm really loving it because I just love like first of all, I really love his writing. And he's a true poet. And everything he writes has a real poetic sensibility to it. And um I love that like since his conversion to Christianity, it has not changed him as a writer, not one bit.
Yeah.
That his writing is just as honest and raw as it was before. That's good. It's good to see Christian artists creating um really lovely work like that. So
Yeah, I'm it's Bard School. Is that the
Bard
name of it?
Skull, yeah.
Yeah,
Bard
I'm gonna.
Skull. It's a collection mostly of Celtic stories. Like a lot of them are from the Mabinogion, which is a Welsh collection. And then there's also some other like there's some Irish stories and whatnot in there too. But I haven't finished it yet. I'm still listening, but I'm enjoying it a lot so far.
Does it into any Arthurian stuff in there?
Mm-hmm. It does.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because the Mabinogion is Arthurian adjacent already. So yeah.
Yeah. That whole so
Arthur appears as a character in the Mabinogion.
yeah. It's funny, I at the very end of here, of the chapter, he quotes a bunch of Blake
Yep.
from Jerusalem.
Yep. Let's end with
And
that.
yeah, so he says, so he talks about how Blake sees logic as something. Earlier he says to Blake, logic is always something that has to be not ignored but conquered or overcome. And so then at the very end he talks about a abstract philosophy warring in enmity against imagination. And then he says, which is the divine body of the Lord Jesus, blessed forever.
Well, you can see that war on TLC all the time.
Yeah, I'm curious
The war of the party of logic and reason against the party of the imagination is raging
yeah.
in TLC constantly.
Well, I'm wondering too. I'm guessing, because Michael Martin's his what you call it, the periodical he edits. It's called Jesus the Imagination.
Jesus the Imagination.
So I wonder if that
it
comes
definitely is. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. I
All
know you
right.
have a hard stop, and
Yeah, I've got a hard stop, unfortunately, but we'll do you want is this gonna be well, we'll talk about the regular time and all that afterwards.
Yep.
I'll get this
Sounds
posted
good.
soon. Talk to you later.
Yeah. Take care.
Bye. Bye.